All right, so we're rolling. So week 5, chapter 5 is where we are. This chapter is entitled Understanding Your Audience. I think it goes without saying to understand your audience is important. I mean, how could you make a speech in front of people that you don't really know who they are? I mean, what do you guys think? Is it useful to you as a speaker to actually know what your audience is having in mind, who they are? What's the makeup of your audience? I think it would make a huge difference. What do you guys think?
I think I think that it should be interesting to know what are the target people that you are going to talk, because if, for example, if you're going to talk like to major people or people that you know that have a high level of education, you will need to properly prepare to the speech that you're going to talk. If
Mm-hmm.
it not, or if you are talking to a, let's say a kids or young people, you may need to make jokes or do something funny to catch their attention. So
That's right.
it depends on the speech.
Okay, good. Yeah. So just right off the top, it's right away very clear, Francisco, that it's helpful to have a composition of your audience in mind. You know who you're talking to. So the chapter begins this whole conversation of mentioning social identity. And social identity is something that, basically it's who we are. Okay. Um, Everyone has a social identity, and not one person's social identity is the same as somebody else's social identity. In that sense, it's who we are. And who we are is usually made up of a number of things. And so there's several, sort of say, criteria or several areas of our life or identity that can be grouped and analyzed. Okay. So here's the problem. The problem is that you're speaking in front of a crowd, you have an audience. Sometimes you know that you're going to be speaking in front of a certain group of people, sometimes you don't. Sometimes, you're speaking in front of whoever gathered, and you don't always get the benefit of preparation ahead of time, thinking, oh, I'm going to be speaking in front of people, and most of them are going to be adults. And then, you look at the room and they're not adults. And all of a sudden you have to adjust, or vice versa. You have a bunch of senior citizens out there listening to you where you were thinking of young adults. And so you're going to have to adjust. So it's good if you know things ahead of time. But if you don't know ahead of time who's actually going to show up, then what do you do? How do you deal with this? You don't know who's out there. You can't really prepare. And you can't address every person individually anyway. Even if you say, I know exactly who's out there, but you can't make, 17 different speeches in 17 different directions, even though you have 17 different varieties of people standing in front of you. You still have to choose kind of to speak to the middle or to speak to in the general direction. So it's a challenging task. Some people can kind of get bogged down and they start worrying, like, what I'm going to say is not going to affect people because they're not listening to me. So this is where having a kind of a preliminary analysis of your audience, or having sort of say a quick assessment basically of who's out there in front of you can be very, very helpful. So the authors here for us, they lay out in this chapter several areas that we can essentially, focus on. And they talk about analyzing your audience demographically on page 56. So what is demographic analysis? Basically, the demographic analysis includes these areas. It's about your listeners' age, gender, education, their group membership, and their cultural and or ethnic background. So that's what we call demographic analysis. It's kind of a fancy word, demographic, It just means demos means people in Greek, and graphos means some sort of a visual representation. So you basically have kind of this picture. You draw yourself a picture of your audience. So Francisco has already mentioned that the age of the people makes a big difference, and whether you're talking to kids or adults, it's a huge difference. With kids, obviously you might have to make jokes, you might have to use puppets. If it's a little like preschool audience or something like that, you may not be able to say much, actually. One of the things that we have to understand of having realistic expectations, if you know that the age of your audience is going to be very young, don't plan on a long speech. It's not going to happen, because you can't. They don't have the attention span. They can't take in a large amount of information just because of their age. They can't do that. So you already, if you know the age of your audience, or if you scan the age of your audience, you're already realizing, okay, I can't say too much, or I can't go on for too long, because I will lose them. They will not connect to what I have to say. So you can't just scan the crowd and say, all right, this is, I'm going to speak to this age, or I'm going to speak to this age. You basically have to kind of go in the middle and say, if you do not have a dominant category of people out there, you have to say, okay, I'm going to speak to roughly this age, or roughly this particular criteria. You kind of set yourself up that way, because the truth is you're going to have audiences of different ages. And so sometimes you just have to average it out and do the best you can. So another feature with age that's really important is how sophisticated is the vocabulary you're going to use. Again, speaking to certain age of people, if you have people who do not have a deep vocabulary, let's put it that way, just simply because they're too young and they haven't even learned those words, because they never studied these particular subjects, then you may have to stay away from certain vocabulary. You may have to use non-specific words, even if you're speaking about something relatively innocent, let's put it that way. So vocabulary is a big difference. The depth, the length of your speech is a big difference. And so knowing the age of your group is going to change your speech. If you have any kind of time references, for example, for somebody who's lived a long life, you can refer to particular people they might remember, okay? You can make time references to the days that they actually lived through and remember. And there's no way they don't remember, because you may refer to something very important or key in history. And of course they will remember that, because they lived through that era. They lived through that time. But then you're speaking to somebody younger who didn't live there, and you make a mistake sometimes of mentioning something, assuming that they know what it is. And the truth is, when that happened, they weren't even alive yet. And they didn't learn about it in history books. Well, simply didn't. Let's put it that way. Our knowledge is imperfect. So a lot of times people know things because they remember them, because they lived through it. You can't assume that people will know, somebody famous or remember somebody famous. So there's certain audiences, for example, that I would speak to. I would drop certain names, famous people from that era, and they would know immediately who I'm talking about. Why? Because those people were famous and they made a big impact, and everybody would say, oh yeah, sure, I know who this is. But then there's other audiences where I would drop the same exact name, and that person would have no idea who I'm talking about. And you see, that's the point that I'm trying to explain, is that sometimes an age of your audience makes a massive difference, and you're simply not able to connect with everyone on the same level. So the examples you use, the terminology you use, is going to have to adapt to the age of your audience. You may not be able to drop certain names and make mentions of certain people because your audience will have no idea who these people are. Because as far as they're concerned, that's outside of their era. So these are kind of important things. So you could see how an age of your audience and knowing the age of your audience will actually shape your speech in one way or another. Now, here's an interesting thing. Gender. How much do you think knowing the gender of your audience will change your speech, or could potentially change your speech? And what are the implications, sort of say, of speaking to an audience of one gender versus to an audience of another gender? What do you guys, what potential, sort of say, problems or issues or obstacles you may see that would rise up with audience of one gender or rise up with audience of another gender? Or would there be any difference? Does it make a difference if you're speaking to a bunch of men or a bunch of women or a mixed crowd? Let's put it that way. Does it make a difference? What do you think? How would you adjust things? Would you need to adjust things? Go ahead, Francisco.
Maybe I think the gender is, for me, the gender is it's not that maybe it's not an important thing unless you are talking about, maybe if you are talking about makeup for girls, or you are talking something like specific to the gender.
Right. So you're saying guys are not going to be listening to your speech on makeup for 25 minutes, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right.
It's because it's not interesting to them. So it's not really, the topic is not gender appropriate. Let's put it that way, right? Is that what you're saying? So that's something, because both men and women listen to different things. That you would think, oh, guys are interested in sports and girls are not interested in sports. Well, that's not true. I've actually found that a lot of times girls are just as interested in sports as the guys are, or politics. You think one is interested in politics, the other one's not. It's most of these sort of say gender biases that we have, where we think one gender is interested in this and another gender is not. A lot of times I find out to be not true. Yes, there are people who simply are kind of, interested or not interested in one particular topic or another, but I don't think a lot of times it has to do with gender. So yes, there are certain topics that are sensitive to gender. Can you think of, any, situations perhaps where speaking on a particular topic, you'd have to be extra sensitive because your audience is largely male or largely female, where, can you think of a scenario of where there would really be a difference? Let's put it that way. Anyone? As far as gender goes, I mean, a lot of times it's easy because, both men and women are interested in all sorts of things. All right, go ahead, Francisco. You have an idea?
Yes, for example, if you're going to talk about makeup, as I said before, mostly of the people that are going to hear you are going to be women.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense because it's something gender specific. I'm going to be talking about, some store having a sale, and it's doesn't even sell men's clothes. So of course, most guys are not going to be interested or something like that. Yeah. So there are some specific areas, but let's say you have a bunch of gay guys who are in the audience, and then they're interested about makeup, right? You never know, right? Because maybe they like it. So
yeah, that's what I was about to say, because in the past there used to be a lot of stereotypes that say, let's say, okay, makeup is only for women and that's it. But now we know that society has been changing a lot. So we don't know if maybe we know that sometimes there's a lot of things in the world. So that right now, I think that everything has changed a lot, so that we don't even know sometimes which type of audience we will have.
Exactly. And so you look at the person and you say, okay, this looks like a crowd of men, right? And they would be interested in guy stuff. And in reality, they're not, because just by looking at the person, you really can't anymore identify where people fit in. right? So as far as their gender identity or whatever that means to them, however much their gender means to them, whether they're traditional kind of guy that wants to talk about sports and cars and things like that or not, we don't know that, because there's lots of guys that I know that don't care about sports, don't care about cars, don't even care about technology. They care about music and art and something else, and you say, wait a minute, how did I miss the boat here? It's because you're using stereotypical kind of gender focused, conversation points, and they're no longer really true. And I don't think they ever have been true to the greatest degree, but now as diverse as we are, even more so. So I think gender can make a difference, because there are some sensitivities, especially when the topic is divisive, when it goes along the lines of men, women, and things like that. You have to be mindful of that. Okay, but it could still be done in a tactful way. So it's helpful to know what gender you're speaking about, in front of, but not always. Let's put it that way. And of course, there are some topics that doesn't matter at all what gender. Now, education level, we already talked about that. Now, that is a little bit more interesting. When you're speaking in front of an audience that's very educated, obviously there's going to be a difference versus you're speaking in front of an audience that's not educated at all, or a little bit educated, or whatever level of their education may be. You might have to adjust your speech here. And as I've already mentioned, the complexity of what you're saying, the depth of what you're saying will change, the vocabulary will change. People will be able to handle different types of speech depending on their education level. And in fact, they will have certain expectations of your speech depending on their education level. So, and the things that would interest them as well will also be keyed to how educated they are. Because, it's just, this is something that I've noticed, in life, is that certain people, they discuss, much of what they discuss is other people, let's put it that way. Then there's a group of people in a different place, mentally, let's say educationally, sophistication-wise, where they are. They discuss things, okay? So either you discuss people or you discuss things, and then there's another category of people who really do not care of discussing people or things. What they want to talk about is ideas. They want to talk about ideas. And I find that it flows along the line of a lot of times education level. The deeper, the more educated people are, the deeper they think, the more they're capable of more abstract thinking about ideas, rather than just concrete things or some person out there who did this and did that. So, and you would see that the certain types of media and certain types of magazines, or even, YouTube videos, they target these audiences based on their education level as well. So, what is the interest point, sort of say? And different levels of education are going to hit different interest points. So somebody more educated will be able to handle more theoretical ideas without them being specifically concrete, where, a less educated person, they need something a bit more concrete to hold on to. And so your topic will have to be different. So anyway, maybe that's stereotypical too. Maybe I'm not being fair here as well, but that's just my personal observation that I'm sharing with you. And so I think educational level, knowing an educational level of the person that you're speaking to can help you. Now, here's another interesting category that the authors talk about on page 58, and that's group membership. Okay, group membership. All right, Maureen, welcome to class.
Hello, sir. How are you?
We're doing really good. We're just rolling in on page 58, if you're wondering, in chapter 5 right now. We're
Okay.
talking about group membership and how that can affect your sort of say your speech, knowing that your audience falls into a particular group membership. So there are groups out there, and groups usually have interests. Groups usually have values. Groups have different attitudes.
Yes.
You can think about sort of say different groups or organizations. If you're speaking to a small businessman club, for example, right? Just think what are they interested in? What are their sort of say point of view on these issues, and therefore you will have to basically adjust your speech, right? If you're speaking to a bunch of businessmen versus, for example, you're speaking to a let's see, a trade union or something like that, or some other professional group, a church group or something like that, and you could see, or a bunch of college football fans. You could see how you would have to say, wait a minute. If I'm making a speech and most of these people belong to a group, and that group happens to be they're fans of a particular sport, then all of a sudden you have to say, all right, now I see what binds them together, and perhaps that is something I can use. Perhaps I can make some references either to that sport that they're rooting for, or favorite team, or in general use that to sort of say hook them into my speech. Let's put it that way, something like that. So knowing that you're speaking in front of an organization or a group of people that are organized in some sort of a cohesive fashion around a cause or an interest of some sort. If you're speaking to a bunch of lawyers out there or doctors, then all of a sudden, this is a group of particular professionals. You know what their interests are, what they care about, and all of a sudden now you have a very clear direction into which to go. Now, sometimes you don't get that. Sometimes you obviously have a mixed audience, and you actually do not know who's in the audience. Well, most of the time you're going to have that. But if you are speaking in front of a particular audience where you kind of know everybody is this way, like, for example, you're speaking in front of students, college students. What do college students have in common? Well, there are certain things that college students have in common. And so maybe you can focus on that. Where, of course, there's going to be a lot of things that they don't have in common. But whatever your speech is about, you can talk about, price of college tuition or something like that, and how everybody's struggling to pay their the bills, and all of a sudden, you get it. All of a sudden, they have this affinity with you right away because you understand them. You know what they're going through in life, and you know the kinds of things that they care about, and all of a sudden, you have rapport. You have credibility in front of them. So knowing a group membership, knowing if you're speaking in front of a group of professionals of a particular, affinity or interest, can tell you how to structure your speech, what to focus on. You can assume that some of these groups will have some identifiable values or attitudes. For example, as I mentioned, college students would have a very negative attitude about raising tuition, for their classes, right? They're going to say, enough, this is already high enough. But if you're speaking to a bunch of, let's say, professional educators who haven't received a raise in the past 5 years, they might say, yeah, it's not a bad idea. Let's raise the tuition, because I haven't seen a raise in 5 years, and I would like to see one. So let's do it. So you will have a negative attitude or a positive attitude about the same exact topic right away, depending on the group you're talking to. So you could see how that room will flip, right? And obviously, if you're speaking to a negative audience and you want to create polarity, then go ahead and pick that topic, and you're going to have some people going for it and some people going against it right away. So that's the dynamic. This is an example of how knowing who is in your audience can actually change the impact of your speech and the feel of your speech and even the energy in the room. Are you going to be received or not, based on what you're saying? And do you have a chance of being, sort of say, friendly with your audience when you know you're picking a topic that's going to get them all upset, sort of say? So you could see how group membership will affect your speech, and that's something you should consider as you're putting it together, or as you're about to deliver it and you realize that your group membership is a little bit different from what you thought it might be. Now, right there on page 58, there's another section that talks about cultural and ethnic background. And of course, this is a question for everyone. As we're stepping in front of people, are we speaking to a particular, identifiable cultural group or ethnic group or not? And I think that's not always so easy to say, okay? Because we really cannot always lean on our perceptual information. If you scan the crowd and you're saying, oh, okay, the audience I'm speaking to is 80% Black. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean anything is the question. Does that give me anything to go on? Can I stereotype and just say that means they're interested in this or not interested in that? And that's where the hard part comes. What if half of my audience, let's say I'm speaking in front of an audience that's 80% Black, and out of those 80% that stand in front of me, a third of them are Africans, okay, and the rest are Americans. And you realize that just because somebody looks dark, where they come from makes a huge difference. A Black person from Africa and a Black person from America might as well be from different planets. They do not think the same way, do not have the same values, they do not see life in the same way, they don't share the same beliefs. And so I can look at the person and say, okay, he looks Black, that means he thinks this or that, and I'll be completely wrong, because I don't realize that person is not from America. He's from Nigeria, and in fact, he doesn't think like African Americans here in the United States think, or he's Jamaican or something else. And all of a sudden you run into a problem where you have just looked at the crowd and you kind of blanket stereotype people, and you said, all right, they belong to this particular cultural group, therefore this is how they think, or this is how they feel, or this is what their attitude is going to be to the topic that I'm presenting. You see, this is where it's good if you know exactly where your audience is culturally, but you can't always assume that cultural knowledge is going to get you something, okay? I'm hoping that you have a certain awareness that different groups and different, sort of say, representatives of various cultural backgrounds feel differently about different topics, okay? And that's true. And we can stereotype and we can categorize, and sometimes those categories are fair, but other times they're not fair, okay? So, and that's where we can get in trouble. And another aspect that should be mentioned is that a lot of people are so, sort of say, mixed in, that we actually have a lot of multicultural identities. Just because somebody looks a certain way, that doesn't mean that they automatically belong to that particular cultural identity. There's lots of people who look one way but grew up an entirely different way. So we no longer have these cultures that are so static, where if you look Asian, that means this. No, it doesn't mean anything anymore. because a lot of Asians were not born in Asia. They were born here in America, and they're more American than anybody else. And that's the problem. We can't always just see and figure it out. If we have an insight, if we have a special sort of say insight into our crowd, then that's a different story. But if we don't, then we're prone to make some pretty serious mistakes and pretty big assumptions, and we can actually get ourselves in huge trouble if we try to play to those assumptions and they work out to be absolutely not true. Does that make sense what I'm talking about, guys? Do you see how this could misfire? Sort of say, if you're not careful, if you're assuming that people, belong to one particular cultural identity and they actually don't. Does that make sense?
Yes, for me.
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. For you, it makes sense?
Yeah, it does, because that example that you said about the I don't know, like color people,
right?
And even that you can think that it's from another culture, another, I don't know, behavior, whatever.
Right.
It can change everything, your perspective and your point of view, I think.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, Nancy. So, where are you from originally?
I'm from Costa Rica.
Okay, Costa Rica.
Yes.
Okay, so do a lot of people, look at you and assume where you're from?
No, they always think that I'm Mexican or Colombian.
There you go. So they think you're Mexican or Colombian. So you kind of get mislabeled, right?
Yeah, because we have like similar ethnics, I think, and it's not very common here in Atlanta to find people from a country.
Exactly. So I haven't met a lot of people from Costa Rica. So it's like, but I have met a lot of people from Mexico. Or Colombia. And this would be easy for me to like, oh, look.
Yeah.
So you get pegged wrong. Do you feel personally like sometimes people don't even realize that you come from Latin America?
Yeah, a lot.
So a lot of times people don't even realize that you're at all from that part of the world. They think maybe you're a European, right? Or something like that.
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
Yeah, my I don't know, my skin and everything does not look like I am American.
Your complexion gives you away a little bit, right?
Yeah. But yeah, it's like and even if you think about it, my country is a very small country, so they don't even sometimes know that country exists.
Right.
So
yes. Yeah. And this is kind of, you could see that even with yourself, you get misidentified, and there's no way of people just looking at you and saying, oh, I know exactly who she is and exactly where she comes from. Yeah. So you will be lumped in with somebody else, and all of a sudden I have totally misidentified you, and this is the trick. This is a hard thing to do, is to look at the person and say, this is who they are, this is where they come from. So for example, when people see my name, they're like, oh, this guy speaks with some thick Russian accent or something like that. They think of that.
I thought that, actually.
See, you mislabeled me.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, no, his English is very clear, and I don't feel his accent. But I think that it's mostly, it depends on the area, because I think that I am, when someone told me, oh, are you from Colombia or from Mexico? Mostly from Mexico. It's because here in Atlanta, we have a lot of Mexican people, let's say. So it's like more likely to maybe compare to some culture that you already know physically.
Right. Yeah, and we always need a point of reference, so things like that. So,
exactly. Yeah.
And so it's easy to mislabel people. When people look at me, they may think one thing. When they see my name, they think of something else. And sometimes just having a little bit of information about somebody doesn't really give you the accurate picture. And that's my entire point. So having a cultural and ethnic background, in mind, doesn't always get us there. Somebody who looks Asian but grew up in America, I used to live in California and LA, and so I'm surrounded. I'm in very large Asian population. And by the way, most of them born and raised in America and speak perfect, absolutely perfect English. And not even for a moment, I would think that, somebody, just because they look Asian, they can't speak, good English. In fact, that was the case most of the time until I moved to another city, and all of a sudden, everyone I meet who's Asian cannot speak English clearly. And I'm saying, what's going on? What happened is I moved from one area that was very heavily Asian dominated to another area that's very heavily Asian dominated. But those were not born here in America. And all of a sudden, I'm stuck. I'm actually just entered, another country. And so these things happen, and we can get confused and misidentify them. So it's tricky. Knowing it helps, but you can't always judge by the looks. Let's put it that way. All right. So how can we, use this demographic information? We talked about the cultural membership, group membership. We talked about the age, the gender, the education. These are all assumptions we make about people. One of the main things that we can say about knowing who you're speaking to is the fact that you can adjust your message. You can custom tailor a message to a particular group or particular age or particular education level by simply scanning the crowd and try to figure it out the best way you can. And you have to be sensitive, to that. And so, yes, you can scale it up, you can scale it down, you can use certain examples or not use certain examples, avoid certain illustrations, or else. And so you can variate the content of your speech by knowing demographic information. And that is probably the biggest point, is that as you gain insight about your audience, whoever they may be, you can alter your speech to work best with them. All right. Now, the next section in our textbook talks a little bit about something that's a bit more complicated. All right. So far, we've been talking about profiling people based on their observable characteristics. How old a person looks, or where do you think they come from, or what culture do you think they belong to based, on their look or something like that. I know it's hard to say how educated people are based on how they looks and things like that, which is why it's kind of a flawed system. But this next section talks about analyzing your audience psychologically. All right. And this is a kind of a tough one for me, because it when it means psychologically, it doesn't mean that your audience is, having emotional issues or something like that. That's not what the authors are talking about here. What they mean is, what do you think your audience feels or thinks about particular topics or issues? It talks about beliefs. It talks about attitudes. I'm sorry, my computer here is sending me messages, and I needed
and values.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I got kicked out here. I don't know, something's happening with my computer. It's like doing some kind of an update or something like that and try to kick me out of the meeting. All right. Yeah. All right, good. So as long as you hear me, I'm good then. So the whole psychological profiling really has to do with ideas of where your listeners are in their minds, so to say. It's more mental rather than psychological as in emotional, let's put it that way. So that's what the authors, of the textbook really mean. So if you look with me on page 60, the authors present this understanding, and this is kind of this is a really important one to understand. Let's put it this way: is what are beliefs? To understand, what does it mean to understand your audience's beliefs? Okay, belief is something that people believe to be true or not true about, some topic. Like, for example, I believe that taking drugs will make you sick. Will make you feel good, but in the end, it's going to harm your health, right? So something like that. It's harmful to your overall health, or something like that. I'm just thinking of an example, and so that's my belief. My belief is that drugs are bad for you. Okay, that's my belief. Now, along with that belief comes an attitude, and also comes a value. Okay, and beliefs and values and attitudes are all connected. So if I believe that drugs are bad for you and they're going to hurt you, they're going to hurt your health, then my attitude is going to be negative, right? That makes sense. And my value is going to line up with that belief. And my value is that you shouldn't hurt yourself, that you should try to stay healthy and, take care of yourself. And so, of course, now my belief and my value and my attitude all line up. So if I believe that this is what drugs do, and then my attitude is going to be negative, and I'm certainly not going to do them because my value is that, hey, I need to stay healthy, So you can see how these things all line up. So that's just one topic, right? That's just one idea, one thought, one concept. This could be true of other things in life as well. So there are beliefs of different strengths. There are beliefs of different degrees, let's put it that way. There are some things we believe strongly. There are some things that we believe on a very basic level. And so when people talk about believing something or not believing something, it's like, there are degrees of belief. Okay. I believe it's going to rain. All right. So I'm going to take an umbrella with me. That's one thing. You could see how my belief is changing my attitude, my behavior, actually. I'm going to take an umbrella with me. I'm going to behave in accordance with my, belief. I believe it's going to rain. Well, how do I believe it's going to rain? Well, I see the clouds coming out, and they're kind of out there in the sky. And so I'm going to say, all right, I think it's going to rain. I really believe it's going to get really, hard weather. Or if I believe it's going to rain really, really hard, I may not even go anywhere at all. I don't want to be caught in this bad weather. So I'm just going to stay home at all. I'm not going to even go. I'm not going to risk it. So, but then other belief that I may have is, about something else, like, believing in God or something like that, and all of a sudden you realize that that's a different kind of a belief. It has a different strength. It has a different emphasis. It's not the same of thinking it's going to rain, because if my belief about rain is proven wrong, how upset do you think I'm going to be? Not so much, so big deal, But if my belief about my faith is wrong, then that has some pretty serious consequences in my life. That rearranges everything, and all of a sudden, I find myself in a whole different place. I believe I only have one brother, and all of a sudden I find out, I have another sibling that I didn't know about, or something like that. And all of a sudden my life is turned upside down and inside out, and I realize that I had a person that's, you know, half brother or half sister out there that I didn't even know existed or something like that. You could see how beliefs, there are different degrees of beliefs, and there are different weights or emphasis on our beliefs. You know, some of them are really important to us and kind of change everything, and where others are more peripheral, they're not a big deal. So there are some things that don't affect us very much that we believe, and they don't bother us as much. You know, I may believe that there's a life out there on some distant planet, right? But since they're not over here walking among us, you know, the aliens are not all around me, so I don't really care. It doesn't really bother me. It doesn't change things so much. So what a person may believe may affect them or not affect them. And so when you speak to audiences and you know what their beliefs are, there are some beliefs that you may challenge or speak about or address, and it's going to get really touchy, because you're touching a belief that's really core, you know, where on the other hand, there will be some, you know, that you will touch where it's not going to be a big problem at all. So, and that is something that you're going to have to make your call on, you know, based on, you know, who are you speaking in front of. If you're speaking in front of a particular audience and you realize this is what they believe, then you may have to adjust big time, because otherwise, unless you line up, you're not going to be able to connect with that audience at all. Or you may create even a hostile environment, you know, if you're not careful. So that's, you know, that's a serious consideration. Okay. If you can figure out which beliefs you share with your audience, that's obviously a very helpful thing. And if you figure out there's some beliefs you do not share with them, and they're very controversial as far as yours and theirs are concerned, you might not want to go there. Okay, you might want to sidestep that topic. Can you see how that can be useful or problematic, you know, of not realizing that, hey, I'm speaking to this audience and they all have this particular belief, and I don't believe that, and all of a sudden, you know, I am totally outnumbered by these people, and you know, I'm going to offend them or say something that's really gonna, you know, cause them to be upset with me. Okay, so that can happen. Now, that's, you know, that's just a little explanation about beliefs. Now, attitudes. What are attitudes? Attitudes are a little bit different. Attitudes is, how do you feel about something? How are you going to respond to something? If I know what you believe, that I can almost predict your attitude sometimes. I will say that person is going to feel negatively about this, or positively about this, because I know this about them, or I know that this is their belief, you know. So things like that. If for example, if I know that you're a very healthy person and you exercise all the time, and I try to say, you know, and I try to give you a commercial about fried chicken or something like that, you're gonna I know that you're gonna say, no, I'm not gonna have that. This is not good for me. I'm a healthy person, you know, I eat fruits and nuts and vegetables and salads, and I don't do fried chicken. And I keep pushing on you, you know, KFC.
You have to eat.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, and I think that in religious things, that's very, very important to take it into account. Because if you're, let's say that you're gonna make a joke about something like that, or everything, whatever, I think that we cannot even know which is the specific religion of each person. So how can we manage that in that case? Or politics, for example.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you right away, you know, as far as religion goes, don't ever make religious jokes, because you will offend somebody in your audience right away. There's no way of knowing what they believe. And political jokes, you can make political jokes if you're speaking in a group that you know their political orientation. So let's say you're speaking at the Republican, you know, convention. You can make all the jokes about Democrats you want. Okay. Why? Because you know that you're surrounded by people who are on this particular side. The majority of the people are actually going to think your jokes are going to be funny, and vice versa. So, but in a mixed crowd, you never know. You have people of different persuasions and affiliations, and so I would say stay away from those topics. If unless you know right away that you are surrounded by people who lean in a particular direction ideologically, I say stay away from that. Those are not the topics you want to joke about, or talk about. Most of the time, this is funny that you ask that. Most of the time I talk to people, it is usually about religion or politics or something like that. I try to stay out of politics because I tell them religion's enough. So, but those are touchy topics, but I wouldn't suggest joking about them. Most of the time when I talk about religion, I talk about serious stuff. I don't necessarily joke about religion.
I
Go
have
ahead.
a question related to, as we are in this university,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, are we allowed to talk about religion, or just like the religion of the university? Or
You can talk about anything. It's a free country.
okay, yeah, that's true, but
I mean, you can talk about anything. It's a free country. I mean, this is obviously a university that comes from a Christian tradition, and so there's a religious program in university, but a lot of students are not religious, and they're taking classes that are not religious. And so it's a very interesting kind of a dynamic. The university is kind of going through a little bit of an identity change, in that sense, because their religious program used to be the largest program, and it's not anymore. And so things are kind of changing, and frankly, they're trying to figure out how to adapt themselves to this new environment.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Does that make sense, Nancy?
Yeah,
Is that what you're asking me about?
Yeah, sure. I was just, because this is my first semester here, and I don't know if, for example, our professors are the same religion as the university, or if we should follow something. I don't know. I just
Right.
That was in my mind.
I mean, I'm going to tell you this. It used to be that every single professor was of one religion here. And that used to be the case. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think we're, a bit more diverse these days. Yeah. But that's because the university is changing. As I said, when it was a purely religious school, that it made sense to do that. But when now people are studying, business and stuff like that, I don't think it matters, whether a person is a Hindu or a Christian. If they know how to teach you statistics, they can teach you statistics, right? So that's the idea. So we're kind of all over the place here, Nancy, but just to kind of give you an idea, that historically speaking, the school was started as a seminary. And so you will see a lot of sort of say remains of those ideas still there. And a lot of people who've been around for a long time still carrying that assumption, okay? Because once you get used to something, it's hard to change. So, but in the last 2 years, the university has changed, a lot. Let's put it that way. At least that's what I've seen. And so it keeps changing every day. All right. Yeah, but joking about religion, I just say, keep that one quiet unless you get people upset. All right. So we're talking about attitudes. So having a positive attitude, negative attitude, how do you feel about things? There are things that people will feel about negatively or positively, whether they're ideas or objects. Okay. And what you have to focus on is the dominance of a particular attitude. If you feel that, people will, majority of the people will not like the kind of sort of say topic that you're picking, then stay away from it. So, for example, criticizing, certain parts of Christian identity at the university that's historically Christian would be a bad idea. Why? Because you have a lot of people who are, thinking that way, and you definitely are going in the wrong direction. Versus if you go to a completely secular university, you could do that, and in fact, you're probably going to get a huge amount of support for that. So it all really depends. but the attitudes are usually connected to people's beliefs and to their values. Now, we spoke about beliefs, we spoke about attitudes. Now, what about values? How are values, different? Values are kind of a much more base and much more foundational in which how they fit into our view of the world and our view of life in general. Okay. They're kind of even more foundational than a person's beliefs or attitudes, because beliefs are very specific and attitudes are usually responses. But values are much more holistic. Okay. They're much more grand. Somebody who believes in freedom, for example, okay, or honesty, those are values, right? So if I believe in freedom, then I believe that I should be able to say what I want to say, freedom of speech. I should be allowed to speak on whatever topic I want to speak, and nobody should tell me what I cannot speak about. Or I should be free to study this topic or that topic, where a person who does not hold that value very highly, they're just fine being told what to do or what to say, what not to say, which topic to approach, or which topic is absolutely forbidden and you should not be allowed to discuss it. So it really depends on what the person's value is. And values will differ from one group to another, from one culture to another, from one person to another. So honesty, how people think honesty is going to change. Let's put it this way. Sometimes some people value honesty much more than others. Okay. You would think that everyone values honesty or even defines honesty in the same way, but that's not true. What people think is honest is actually differs from person to person. Some people would think that absolute honesty is necessary, where other people are okay with being dishonest about some things and at some times. So even with that, you're going to find a big range of opinions. The example that the textbook uses right here, it says, imagine trying to convince a friend to renounce their citizenship. Okay. Imagine this is what you're trying to do, right? Imagine how hard it would be to try to convince somebody to give up your citizenship, like whatever you're citizen of, and a lot of times people are very proud of their country. They're very patriotic about it. They love their culture. And so they're like, I don't want to give up my citizenship, right? And so no matter how hard you try, you will probably, let's say, you will probably encounter serious resistance, and a person will say, no way, I'm not doing that, and that's not going to happen. That's assuming they actually are very patriotic about the country they come from. Okay. And you're hitting a value that's fundamental. You're hitting a, something that's very important to them. It's at the core of who they are. Stop being this. And they say, I can't stop being this. This is who I am. This is where I belong. These are my people. And so how can I say I'm done with that? So it's not going to happen. This is how values are. When you believe something in your very core, when you sort of say embrace a particular principle or an ideal, it's not just something you believe about life. Those are things that people are not likely to give up, and values is where you really can't move people very easily on. Okay. They're much more foundational, much more basic. You may be able to change people's attitudes and you may be able to change people's beliefs, but changing people's values is probably the hardest thing you can ever do. So where this is very useful, this conversation, is if you're doing a speech to persuade somebody, it's very hard to change their values. Although sometimes that's the best thing you could do. It's not something you can do in a speech. You may change their belief. That's easier done. Attitude are harder to change. Values are even harder, because that's just kind of how they go. So I don't know if it's helpful to you or not, but on page 61 in your textbook, there's a couple of charts here. There's a 5-1 chart and 5-2 chart. And they try to explain to you the sort of, say, relationship between values and beliefs. So if you want to glance with me on these, let's see if we can work them through just a little bit. So here's 5-1. So belief, seatbelt saved lives. Okay. Attitude, fastening my seatbelt takes too much time. So what just happened? I believe that seatbelts save lives, but I don't want to fasten my seatbelt. I have a negative attitude towards fastening a seatbelt because that takes just too much time, you know. So you see what happens. My attitude and my belief do not line up. Why? Well, because the truth is, yeah, I believe that's good for me, but I'm not going to do it anyway. So I have a disconnect here. Here's another one. Vegetables contain important minerals and vitamins. That's a good belief. You know, broccoli tastes good. And now my attitude and my belief actually line up. So it tastes good. I like the way it tastes. And it's also, you know, good for me. So what I believe about it is working out with how I behave, what my attitude is. All right. So AARP represents the interest of older American. AARP is a, let's see, association of, you know, American Association of Retired Persons. That's what AARP stands for, in case you don't know. You know, and then the attitude is, you know, I love grandfather. Well, that actually does not line up at all, if you think about it, because you loving your grandfather has nothing to do with AARP at all. They're not even connected. So you could see how sometimes things line up, sometimes things do not line up at all. But if you look at 5-2, the next chart, this is a little bit more helpful here. So at the very core of this, you know, center, you see it says human life is sacred. Human life is sacred. Now that is a value. If a person thinks that human life is sacred, this is something that they believe deep inside of them at the core, okay, then you will see that the you know, the attitude that a person would adopt is that abortion is wrong, for example. Okay, so if you believe that life is sacred, that you just can't take life because life is not something that you should control as a human, a life of another human, you know, then abortion would be wrong. You know, you can believe the same thing about murder. You can believe the same things about capital punishment, you know, things like that. So an attitude that flows out of a value that life is sacred is that abortion is wrong. And therefore, your belief, you know, is most Americans oppose abortion. So people say, I don't believe in abortion. Why? Because abortion is wrong. Why? Because human life is sacred. And you kind of see the logic and how it follows from a more, you know, basic to the more complex, from the more deeper, sort of say, value. So values are at the center. They're at the core, and they're very difficult to change. I may be able to convince you, you know, not to oppose abortion or something like that for some whatever reason. But if deep inside you believe that you cannot kill another human being, then obviously you're not going to go for it. And so I can't change that. You could see how there are some values that you will come up against that you might try to sort of say work with that, but it's going to be very difficult. So values, attitudes, and beliefs are connected, and a lot of times they are culturally transmitted, and a lot of times they are sort of say entrenched in the way our culture thinks and feels and believes. So there are certain values that all Americans have, you know, and there are, you know, certain values that certain non-Americans have. So and sometimes it is our culture. It is what ends up guiding us, into embracing a particular value or an attitude or belief. And so, in that sense, knowing where a person comes from, or where their what their culture is, can give us a really good insight into how they feel about certain things or certain particular topics. And so sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. All right. But for what it's worth, if you do have an insight into your audience, and you have an insight into their attitudes or their values or beliefs, which are all now interconnected, as you understand, that can give you an edge, sort of say, in your speech. And that can, make you a better speaker, a more effective speaker, if you know these types of things ahead of time before you even decide to let's say, write your speech. All right. So anyway, that's where we are right now. Let's pause for a few minutes. You guys take a little break, maybe 10 minutes or so. And let's see, it's 4:46. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and we will resume our chapter.